Many popular third-person games that involve combat often have a target lock-on system. From The Legend of Zelda to Elden Ring, these systems allow the player to accurately hit the enemies they wish to hit without having to manually aim their attacks. When it comes to Dreams on the PS5 or the PS4, there aren't any out-of-the-box solutions available to instantly add this to your own game, until now. I've created a targeting system that is simple to add to any game, and when I say simple, I mean it. Just drop the chips in and you're good to go. Not only will I be showing you how to add this to your game in this video, but I'll also go over how it's made in detail. Whether you're interested in the behind the scenes action, or just want to implement it in your own game, this video is for you. I've added timestamps in the description below in case you're only interested in a certain part, but otherwise, grab a drink and a snack, sit back and enjoy the video. Alright, for those of you interested in just putting this into your game, this is what the title is, VK Targeting Lock-On System. And so if you want to use that in your game, all you have to do is look up my profile and you should be able to find it. And in here are a couple of things. So we have a README, this is notes in case you forget how something works or you stop watching this video halfway through. The variables you don't need to worry about, you can just leave this alone. And then there are some settings that I set up. So there's a minimum right stick input. This is for switching targets. So this is like for dead zone type of stuff. So if you had it at 0, it might not work great. So I set this to a minimum of 0.1. You can put this to whatever you want. And then here's the target indicator color. So you just set the color you want here. And that's what the target indicators will look like. And then there's the player chip and the enemy chip. To put this into your player, let's say you have a puppet. What you want to do is you want to take the chip from here and just pop it right into your puppet and turn it on. And so there's a couple things that you just need to make sure are in the right place. So there's a tag here. Pop that into your player's feet. Good to go. Then you have this zone, and what you want to do with the zone is you want to make sure that it's big enough for what you're doing. The things that you're targeting have to be within this zone when you're playing. So that's why I set it in front of it and not behind it. Okay, and so once you're happy with whatever your zone is, make whatever changes you need. What you should do is delete this one here, copy this one up, and then set this to 1. So you need 2 of them, unfortunately, but you could set this to 1 or you can set it to all. This alone won't trigger everything. There's this camera pointer that you may want to use. If you're using the built-in controller sensor for a puppet, then this will make that camera look in that direction when you're targeting. That's when the state is targeting. And that's it for the player. So for enemies, you can put the enemy chip into puppets, and you can also put it into non-puppets, so like a sculpt, for example. And so for enemy puppets, you would take the enemy chip and you place it into the puppet logic chip here. And all you have to do is make sure that this thing is roughly where the enemy is. And that's it. There's also the target indicator, so you can move that too. For some reason it doesn't seem to like putting it in a good spot by default. So play with that, see how you like it. If you don't want to use the target indicator, you could just use this targeted variable to, I don't know, make them glow or something, keyframe, whatever you want. Okay, so that's that. And then to put it into a non-puppet, the only thing that you have to make sure you do is you have to make sure it's grouped in. Okay, so I grouped in the chip with the block. And the reason I do that is because this is using variables and it uses the here setting. So you want to make sure that it's grouped in, otherwise it won't work correctly. And that's it. So with that, these 2 things should be working. And let's give it a go. So if I click R3, that's what starts the targeting. And then I can use the right stick to switch targets as long as I make sure to turn the chip on. Okay. So if I move my right stick to the right, it switches targets, and you stay targeted onto the one you're targeting, and you can switch around, and then you can click R3 again to stop targeting. There's also a default distance, so if you run too far away, then it stops targeting and it resets everything. It seems pretty easy to me. You literally just drag the chips in, and then when you're done, just make sure these two things are somewhere around. Don't put them in your puppet. Don't put the settings. Well, you can put the settings probably in the puppet, but don't put the variables in there. So yeah, you can put the settings in there, but don't put these in here, because if the puppet dies, you want to make sure things reset. And then you can delete any extra chips, so if you're done putting it in your enemies, you can delete that. I did record myself building this, so if you're interested in seeing how everything works, like all the logic and stuff, stick around because I'm going over that now. If this is all you need, then I hope this helps. Make sure to leave some feedback for me, either in dreams or on YouTube, whatever. Let me know if it works, if it doesn't work, if you come across any bugs, all that good stuff. Alright, let's get on to the build. Okay, in order to get started, let's go ahead and set up some controls. And so we'll grab a controller sensor and we'll bring it in. I'll set it to remote controllable, and we will have some way of changing one of our variables. And this will hold all of our variables here. I'm going to prefix all of my variables with this VK targeting, so that in case you want to use this in your game, chances are you won't have a variable named VK targeting followed by some text. So let's go ahead and give this power. We'll also have one called state. And so power is just going to be something from 0 to 1, meaning off or on. And so in here, what we can do is we can get the power output, and if that's on, then we can set it to remote controllable. Otherwise, we'll have it off. So we could do it that way if you don't want to use a keyframe. If it's not powered, then we will disable the controls. So we leave it on remote controllable, but if it's not powered, then the controls are disabled. Now our state is going to have more than a 0 or a 1, but when we're accessing it from the controls, we're going to set it to either 0 or 1. So this will set the state to 0, or it'll set it to 1. And then whatever our input is, we could just plug that straight into this active port. So if I have it on X, we can see the state is at 0, and let me also give this some power so that we can use the controls. When I hold X, it switches to 1, and when I let go, it switches to 0. Some games have you hold the targeting button, like in Tunic or The Legend of Zelda. Other games like Elden Ring or Jedi Fallen Order, etc. have a toggle. And so in order to do that, let's go ahead and set up a toggle here. And inside the custom remapper, I'm just going to say toggle output at on. And so if I start time, it's currently at the state 0, and if I press L1, now we're in the on state. And if I press it again, then it'll turn it off. So 0 will be ready, 1 is when it is seeking a target, and 2 is when it's targeting. So another thing that we'll need inside of here is some sort of tag. Okay, so I have this player position tag, and this is at the center of our character, or at least between the feet. In order to send the position to our various enemies, we could use something like a wireless transmitter, but these have a single frame of delay, and I want there to be as little delay as possible in this, so I'm going to add a couple more variables here. Okay, so here I have player position X, player position Y, and player position Z, and so I want those values to always being sent to those variables. So I will split the scene space transform, and I'll split the position as well. And now we can get out the variable modifiers. So we have them going into X, Y, and Z. Ooh, this should be a Z. And now we'll set these all to continuously while powered. So while we move around, these variables will change. If I were to pin this to the screen, we could take a look and see what that looks like. You can see it's always being set to where our player position tag is. So if we were to have an enemy somewhere, we could get that player position using the variables. And so here we have all of the variables put into a combiner, and now we have a fat wire containing all of those values. Now if we were to have a tag on the enemy as well, then we can see the distance between our player and the enemy. The easy way to do that is we'll take the position here from the tag, and we have the position of the player, and we can use a calculator, and inside of the the vector tools, we can get distance between vectors, and this outputs 2.1. We can see that the further this moves away from the player, the higher that value is, and the closer, the lower that value, and no matter which direction, it's always a positive number. And so now we want to be able to target the closest opponent or enemy to the player. It doesn't even have to be an enemy, it could just be anything that's targetable. Depends on how the game works. Okay, so we will also have a variable inside of the targetable objects, and this will be called targeted, and this will be local, so each one of these will have their own. So if we were to get the state, if that would be equal to 1, that means we are seeking. If it's 0, we don't want to target. If we start targeting, then it'll be in the seek state, at which point it's going to look for the closest target, and then 2 will be targeting. We could use a calculator. We could also use a selector. We'll plug this state in here, and if it's 1, then we can turn on this variable. So if we were to set targeted here to 1, then you'll see when I press L1, this becomes targeted. Okay, but if we had more than 1, we wouldn't want them both to be targeted, right? And right now, they would both be set to targeted. So what we want to do is we want to use this distance, and the closest one should be the only one that gets targeted. So we can do this in a variety of ways. I'm going to use an exclusive gate here. I set the priority to something reasonably high, like 100,000. We'll take a signal manipulator, and we will invert the input and plug that into the priority, and we'll multiply against that. So we'll see that it's inverted, so this is set to negative 100,000, but if there's one further away, we would see this is negative 525,000. So this is a much lower number than this one, and so if I were to start time, then only this one would be allowed to turn on. What we'll do is we will set this as the input here, and if this is active, then it'll turn it on. And we see if I press L1, only this one turns on because it's closer, so only this one should be targeted. Let me make sure that this is set to here. Oh, I see. Now because the variable is in this chip, but the chip isn't grouped with the object, I need to group it up with the object itself, and now the here property should work. So if I press L1, this one gets set to targeted, this one does not. And then if I press L1 again, that should clear all of this stuff. So inside of our controls, we can also change the value of targeted everywhere to 0, or we can reset it. Okay, so now when I press L1, this one's targeted, this one isn't. If I press L1 again, none of them are targeted. Okay, so we have that working, so it'll target the closest one and not the further one. But now that one's set to targeted, what we want to do is we want to change the state from seeking to targeting, so that way it stays locked on. So one way we could do that is we could set the state to 2. We'll set that everywhere. So we have the state, we'll output that here on the left hand side, so we see we're at 0. If I press L1, it goes from 1 quickly to 2 because something is targeted. Now if I press L1 again, it goes to 0 and nothing's targeted anymore. Now that we have that working, let's go ahead and see how we can maybe make this look a little bit better. So we will get the state, And if our state is at 2, meaning we're targeting something, then we should probably have the player face that target. We want to turn on a look at rotator. And so this look at rotator we want to be facing forwards. And now we want to plug in a direction for this to look. So this will be what turns it on. Oops, we want this to be equal. And then we want to plug in something so that the player looks in the correct direction. There's two ways of doing this. We could have it look at a position, or we can have it look at a direction, in a direction. So a position is like where it is in the world. A direction is no matter where you are in the world, the same direction will always have you look in the same way. For the case of this, we're just going to have this thing look at the target position. And again, I could send the position, which we have right here, through a wireless transmitter, but I want, again, this thing to have as little delay as possible. So I'm going to copy these and I'm going to make one for target position. Okay, so I have target position X, Y, and Z. If this is ever targeted, then we can go ahead and send this position out. Do basically the same thing that we did in that other chip, where we'll take all of these and we will output these into these variables. Now I only want this to be the case when we are the target, when this thing is the target. So targeted. And I'm going to get here. Okay, so I can plug all of these into each one of those things, or I can just plug that whole thing into this chip. Okay, so this is setting the target position, and that'll only be on when this is the one that's targeted. I have this location displayer object. Let me just go ahead and output this. So we have the target position here. Plug that in. And so we see currently there is no target position, everything's at 0, but if I tap L1, now we have a target position of 2.003 and negative 0.003, which is interesting. There we go. Reset the tag a little bit. There we go, so 200. So this object is the one that's targeted, not this one, right? And again, it only targets the closest one. And we can see that the player also looks at it. Now if this one's closer, it'll target that one instead. And then if I press L1 again, we're no longer targeting, but we see the target position is still set. So when we reset the state, we also want to reset those variables. So inside of here, I'm going to move all of this into a chip here. Let's go ahead and take these out. And we'll put these into this chip. So whenever this is getting powered, all of these things will turn on. So we have the targeted being reset, we have the state being set to 0, which that could also be reset. And then we just need to reset those other values, which would be the target X, Y, and Z. Okay, so we have X, Y, and Z being reset every time we switch. So if I target something, we can see our target position here, and if I untarget, then it gets reset. And so, believe it or not, that is the targeting. So now we can see our player will aim at this target, and it will, oh, we see right there it actually switched, which is not what we wanted to happen, right? We can see it's looking at the closest one, which is not what we want. So let's go ahead and see how we can fix that. So in order to get the priority to stick, once we're targeting, meaning our state is 2, then we want to freeze this output. One other thing we need to change is the way this look at rotator is working. We actually haven't sent that value in. So let me get those values. And that will look at that target position. Okay, so now let's go ahead and pin these two things to the screen here so we can watch and see how these things work. And let's go into test mode. So if I'm closest to this one, it's going to be targeted. That's the chip on the left there, as you can see. And as we get closer to this other object, that won't become the target. So we're always locked on to this one thing unless we change the state. So if I press L1 again, now we're no longer targeting something. This one's now closer, and so that one becomes the target. It's working great. And one thing I want to do is, we don't necessarily want to target the closest thing that's behind us, right? If we were playing this as a game and we're aiming this way, we probably want to target the thing in front of us. But if I switch right now, I'm targeted to the thing that was closest to the player, and so we probably only want to generally target things that are ahead of us. So what I'm going to do is I'll get out another microchip, and I'm going to put in a trigger zone here, and this is where a single frame of delay will come from, but not in any big way, because this is basically what's going to allow all of the logic in the enemies to turn on. So this will look for some sort of tag, and why don't we go ahead and set up what that tag looks like. So I'm going to take everything in this microchip and I'm going to put it inside of another microchip like this, and realistically we could probably leave that on. I've gone ahead and created this targetable tag, and if that's ever activated, then we can turn this on. Now, one thing to concern ourselves with is this targeted gets set to on, and then if it moves out of range, there's nothing that's going to turn it off. So I think what I'll do is, if this is ever not active, then we'll reset the value of targeted here. So we have targeted here, reset, and so that will set it back to 0. Okay, so targetable is the tag we're looking for, so we'll set this to targetable, and we'll go ahead and use a square shape, and so we'll have this thing only look generally ahead of us. So we can set it kind of wide and probably a decent amount of ways ahead like this. Okay, and so if that's ever the case, then we'll be able to target it. And so this one back here won't be in that range, and so we'll see that this is off. So now if I were to go into play mode, if I press L1, we can see I'm targeting, and I'm targeting onto this one. And let's say I run a decent amount of ways away. Let's see what happens. So this is no longer being targeted, right? So targeted was set to 0, but we didn't have anything to turn off the state here, right? Because our controller is what's doing it. Okay, and so in order to reset that, we have this targeted, which is an individual one in each of these, but if we set it to everywhere, if that's ever not, if basically this is ever 0, then we know we can reset the state. So this probably doesn't belong in there. I'm going to paint this one green so that we know this is like our zones and stuff. So I'll get out one more thing here. I'll put a little flag. And so this will just be a check. So if targeted is ever 0, then we know we can reset the state. So let's go ahead and reset the state. So we'll do it like this. So if this is ever equal to 0, then we'll reset. Alright, one more time, here we go. So I'm targeting onto this thing, everything's working great. Now if I run super far away, then the state gets reset and we're no longer targeting. And then once I come back here, now I can target onto something again, maybe. Yep. And if I run far away, then it goes back to 0. Now there's an issue here. If I press L1, what it's doing is it's resetting this control. This thing is staying on, so it thinks that it's targeting, but it's not. And so what we need to do is we need to clear this out. So we actually want to do this a little bit differently. So I'm going to set this to a pulse, and we'll get the value of the state here, So we'll get the value of the state. And what will happen is we will just negate that value. So if this is 0 and we press L1, that will set this to 1 when I press it. So if I press L1, it switches, and if I press L1 again, it switches back to 0. And so all of this reset stuff, we can move out of the controls itself, and we'll move it into here. Right, so this is if targeted is 0, right? That'll set state to 0. And what we can also do is then this is also resetting it to 0, so we can just get rid of this completely and do that. And we can also say that if state is equal to 0, then we'll also power that. So now inside of this flag, this is like our reset chip basically. If we're ever not targeting something, so target is 0, or our state is 0, then we will reset targeted. We could also reset state too if we wanted, because one or the other is basically, they're both contained within this, right? If we're not targeting something, then we want to reset the state. If we switch the state to 0, we also want to reset targeted. So we'll reset the state, we'll reset targeted, and we'll reset the positions. So if I'm in here, if I press L1 again, we switch back to the 0 state, and our target gets reset. And if I run far enough away from this, we'll see that it also gets set to 0 and it resets. And now if I tap L1 again, then we switch to targeting. And again, I can either get out of it by pressing L1 again, or if I run far enough away, then it gets reset. Okay, so I labeled these chips. So I have the look at target chip, we have the controller chip, we have this reset conditions, and this is zones, and I'm also going to include the tag, so I'm just going to put this in here. And so now what we can do is we can think about how we're going to go ahead and switch targets, right? The big question. So we'll see that I'm targeting onto this one, but what if I want to switch to the one to the right there, to the right of the player? What if I want to switch to this one that I'm looking at? Right now to do that, I'd have to untarget, get close to this one, and re-engage the target lock, which is not very fun and could be really annoying to deal with. Generally, when you want to switch, you want to use something like the right stick from a controller to differentiate which way you want to switch. So if I had 3 targets and I'm locked in onto the middle one, if I want to switch to the right target, I'd probably want to flick my right stick to the right and have it switch. Similarly, if I want to switch to the left one, I'd hit the left stick or the right stick to the left, and that should switch targets as well. Okay, so let's say we have a line going from our player in the direction that we're looking, right? And now we have some options of things we want to switch to. We want to switch to potentially that one, or we want to switch to potentially this one. What we can see is that there's actually some information here that we can gather. So the information we can gather are these angles, right? We have an angle from here between these 2 lines, and we have another angle here between these 2 lines. So I don't know what these angles are off the top of my head. I'd have to find out. But let's just say this is like 30 degrees, and let's say this is 30 degrees, right? And let's just say there's another block over here, and we have this line over here, right? Then we still have another angle to look at, which would be this angle here, right? And so that would be something bigger. That would be like maybe, I don't know, 50 degrees, right? So if I tap the stick to the right, I want to switch to the one that has the lowest angle, right? Because if I tap it to the right, I don't want to switch to this target over here. I want to switch to this one. So I want to switch to the one with the lowest angle. And there's actually a handy new output here called angle between vectors. So vectors are, we can think of vectors as lines for this example. So this is one vector, and this is another vector, and this is another vector. So if we got the angle between these two lines, and we got the angle between this line and this line, we'd see which one is smaller, and whichever one is smaller, we'd switch to that. Okay, so in order to get the line between our player and the target, there's two different ways we can do that. So one way we can do that is by taking the position of our target and the position of our player and subtracting them. We have our tag here, right, with the player position being fed in, and we also have our target position. So if this is our target, we'll have that. So let's take a look and see what that gives us. Okay, so if I subtract the target position from our player position, or let me rephrase that, if we subtract our player position from our target position, we will get a new vector, and that will be the line. So let me start time, and I'll target. So I'm targeting this one here, and we see we have a line, and that line is 0, 0, 2.8, right? And that's because it's taking it's taking our player's position, which is 0.2, and it's being subtracted from the target position, which is 0.03, and we get this resulting line. And then if we had another line to this one, this would be this position minus the player's position. Then we would also have a second vector, at which point we could then take the angle between them. I'll just copy this. And so we have the player position, and now this is where the target position is, so we'll get rid of the target position, and we'll just plug this straight into here, and that gives us a different line. Okay, so now we have one vector here, and we have another vector here. So this is the way where the player is looking towards our target. We also have this line here, which is the line between the player and this alternative target. If we were to take that value, or take these two lines, and find the angle between them, we would get a value. Now the value is output in radians. If you wanted to see it in degrees, it's pretty easy to do. You don't really have to worry about that, but this will now give us a value in degrees. So we actually see this is 76.9 degrees, not 30. Copy a new one over. We take this value, we plug it in there. This one is 91.7 degrees. Okay, so this is 91 degrees, not 50, and the other one was 76 degrees. So we would take the lower one and make that the priority for switching targets. That's one way to get that value, by subtracting the player position from the target position. There's actually an easier way to do this, and that is by using motion sensor or movement sensor. So we have this movement sensor, and we can see there's a line sticking out here, this Z line. And if we set it to local space, then this Z line will always be where we're looking. So let me just show you what I mean. If I go into test mode, we can see this Z direction is always pointing where the player is looking. And if we're targeting something, because of the look at rotator, we're always looking at the target. So we can just get this Z direction straight out of this movement sensor and use that as the line. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what that looks like, this Z direction. And we'll see that this should look very familiar. It's 0, 0, and 1. What was it before? It was like 2.8, right? Here, let's go back and take a look. So here we have, let's turn on the targeting. So we have 0, 0, 2.8, and like I said, that's basically the same vector. And if you come into here and use this normalized vector, we'll see that what we get is 0, 0, negative 1. Okay, so The reason it's -1 as opposed to +1 is simply because the direction. So I think if I were to switch this, then it would be 0, 0, 1, right? So we have 0, 0, 1 coming from this thing, or we could just get rid of all of that and just use the movement sensor, make sure it's on local space, and we take the Z direction. And that will give us the same thing, and this way we don't rely on state. We will always have this vector ready to go. Okay, so I have the player forward X, forward Y, and forward Z. So when I say forward, that's the forward vector, that's the direction that the player is looking. And I'm just going to set these always. So if I plug the forward values into this, so we can see when we're looking over here, it's roughly 1, 0, 0. When I'm looking this direction, it's roughly 0, 0, -1. When I'm over here, it's -1, 0, 0. And when I'm looking this way, it's 0, 0, 1, roughly, right? And we get all the values in between. Okay, so we have our forward vector, we have our player position, and our target position. So there we go. So what we want to do is we want to take the angle between the forward vector against the vector between the player and the target itself. So we have this player position, and we also have the target position here, which is from the tag. We can subtract those, and that gives us a line between the target and the player. And then we also have the vector given to us from those variables, which is the forward vector. Okay, so we have the X, Y, and Z of the forward, and we plug that in, and we get some angle here. This one should be 0 degrees. Let me start time. There we go. Okay, so we have 0 degrees here. So this object is 0 degrees, meaning that the angle between the line in the direction that we're looking and the line between the player and the vector is 0 degrees apart because they're the same line. This one is 53. Oh, I see. So it's because time was paused. This one is 53.7 degrees. Oh no, that one is. This one is 36.0 degrees. Okay, so I was actually kind of close. So 36 degrees, 50 something degrees, 0 degrees, and this would be, if I start time, 28.6 degrees. Okay. What about if I wanted to switch to the left or to the right? This angle between vectors will always give a positive value. So this thing was like 70 degrees, and this thing would also be like 70 degrees, right? It wouldn't say -70, it would also be positive. So in order to do that, we have to use just a little bit more math here, and it's actually really simple. And what we can do is we can use something in the vector tab here called the cross product. Now in order to explain the cross product, let me show you what it does. So here we have this A vector and we have a B vector, and the green one, the C, this is the cross product. So cross product will always give a vector based off two other vectors, and what it does is it always gives a vector that is perpendicular to the A and the B vector. So the angle between these is 90 and the angle between these is 90, and no matter where these two vectors are, it will always find one that is perpendicular to the two. Now what's interesting about this is we can see that A and B are like this and C is going upwards. But if we were to switch this so that they were aimed in a slightly different direction, this is still the same thing, but now we flip them. C goes downwards. Basically, we can use this to differentiate between left and right, right? Let's say A is our target, and B is what we want to switch to. We can see that C is going upwards, but if B was over here on the right, then C is going downwards. So we can use the Y value from this cross product to determine whether we want to switch left or right, or which one is to the left of A and which one is to the right of A from the player's point of view. So if B is to the right, then the Y value may be negative, and if B is to the left, then the Y value may be positive. Here's where we can do that. So we take the cross product, and we'll just go ahead and normalize this. And so that's going to be the cross product between these two lines. And what we get out is another vector. And since we're only dealing with targeting things like left and right, when I start time, we'll see that we'll get either a -1 or a +1 in the Y axis. And so this one over here, when I start time, this is +1, and this one over here is -1. So using the difference there between -1 and +1, if one is less than 0, then we want to know we want to switch one direction, and if it's +1, then we want to switch the other direction. If we swapped these, that would also swap the signs. And so now this one would be +1, meaning to the right would be positive, then to the left would be negative. I think I like that because when we're dealing with the stick output from the controller sensor, we can see that when I'm moving the stick to the right, X is positive, and when I'm moving the stick to the left, X is negative. So it's easy to remember that way. So if we have it set up so that to the left is negative and the right is positive, then we'll be able to differentiate very easily. It's nice to look at the degrees. This does add some gadgets and some wires, so I'm just going to use the radian output, and what I want to do is take this B value and we'll multiply these things together. Okay, because this is either going to be a 1 or a -1. If I were to move this thing, we'll see that that angle changes and it gets closer to 0 as we get in front of it. And when we go the other direction, then it becomes negative. Remember, we had the state set up. We're going to add one more state here, and this will be for switching. Okay, so when the state is 3, then it's trying to switch to a target, at which point, once it finds it, it'll go back to 2. With 3, that's how we'll know to use not this exclusive gate, because remember, this exclusive gate is only on when the state is at 1. We'll use the new exclusive gate for switching. And now what we want to do is we want to set up the controls here. So we only want to switch when we are currently targeting something and there's another target nearby, right? So we don't want to be able to send any switching input when we're not targeting, because that doesn't make any sense. We also, if we're targeting something and there's no other things in the area, then there's no reason to switch off of that target to try and find a new one. So we have some conditions there. So basically the state has to be 2, meaning we're targeting something, and there has to be another target nearby. So remember, we had this targetable, and this is currently just looking for any tag. And if we were to copy this targetable thing and set this number required to 2, meaning there's at least 2 things in that zone that have the targetable tag, we should be able to switch, right? We can see currently this one is on because it's seeing 1. This one is seeing less than 2, so it's not on. If we were to have another one in the area, then it becomes on. I'm going to create another variable. Okay, so I've actually named it multiple enemies nearby. This is going to be on or off, and that will be set continuously while powered by this thing. It'll be 0 when there's only 1, or when there's less than 2 targets. When there's more than 1 target, then it'll be 1. Okay, so in the controls, now we have our 2 conditions. So we want to make sure that the state is equal to 2. So we'll go ahead and check that. The state is equal to 2, and there are multiple enemies nearby. Then we can go ahead and input our switching control. Also, to account for stick drift, we should probably set some variable for like a minimum amount that needs to be pressed, which this can be adjusted, through a settings menu or something like that. So I've created this minimum right stick input, and I'll just set this to something like 0.2. So if I have this greater than, and I have the minimum stick input, so we have the minimum stick input and we have this greater than, we will get the absolute value of our X, plug that in. So now it moves both, it works both left and right, but I still have to press it at least 20% of the way there. And now what we need to do is we need to send the actual value into this signal manipulator. So this can go from -1 to 1. So if I were to just remap it like this, we can see how that looks, right? I can move left and right, cool. But we actually only need this to be very small. So this way, this has to be on for this to work. We can see that this is either going to give us a +1 or a -1. For some reason that's giving us a -10. Let me clamp the values. +1 or -1. There we go. There's a couple things happening here. This is telling us we're ready to switch. So this is like sending a signal saying, hey, I want to switch. And this is telling us which direction we want to switch. And this can set the state to 3. So this will set the state to 3. Okay. And this we want to pass in to another variable. And so we'll get out another one. Okay, so I have this switch direction. So 1 would be to the right and -1 would be to the left. We can see that if I'm targeting and I press to the right, we're sending out a 1. And if I press to the left, it'll be -1. So all we have to do is send that out. So let's get the switch direction here. That will also power here. So if I target and then I press to the right, we get a +1. If I press to the left, we get a -1. We forgot to include that the state is equal to 2 and there's multiple enemies nearby. So let me go ahead and bring this stuff back out real quick. Okay, so all of these conditions have to be met. Let me set this to 3. So it's these two conditions as well as this condition. There we go. So let's make sure that that looks correct. So if I press right and left, nothing happens. If I'm targeting onto something, then I press left and right, nothing happens. That's because we only have one target out. So if I get another one out and I target something, now if I press right, it'll switch this to 3 and we see that our switch direction is 1. And if I press left, then it'll be 3 and our switch direction is -1. I'm just going to add a little bit of a indicator here so we can see. Okay, so there's a little target indicator and that will be on when we're targeting, when that thing is the target. So now if I press L1, we can see there's a little indicator there. Cool. So inside of these things, I'm going to have a variable called angle difference. Instead of outputting this angle difference, I'm just going to put it in here. So we'll get the angle difference and we will set that here continuously while powered. So as this moves, that thing will constantly update. We have that. I'm also showing it here. This is the angle difference. One thing I think I'm going to change over here, this is setting a stick direction, a switch direction. I think I want to get rid of that. I think instead what I'm going to do is let's get out a variable, 2 actually. One's going to be switch left. The other one, so this one's switch left, this is going to be switch right. And then inside of our controls, we're gonna set that instead. Let's use a selector. We'll set it to 3 ports and we'll take this number here out of here and we'll add 1 and that will go into the active port. We're targeting. If I press to the right, that'll switch to C quickly. Similarly, if I were to press to the left, that would switch to A. So I'm going to update switch left and switch right from those things. And so that's what will set those things. So we'll see here that when I press right, this one flashed for a second. I also switched this to L2 instead of L1 because I kept accidentally turning it on and off when I was opening and closing chips and stuff. but we're no longer going to have this switch direction. And instead of setting the state here to 3, I'm going to do it inside of the enemy. Okay, so we're going to set left or right that way, which means we can then get those values here. We'll see if I'm targeting and I press left, this one flashes. If I press right, the other one flashes. And so now we're going to get out some different exclusive gates. So this one is still based on distance, but it only gets an input when we're on state being 1, meaning we're seeking. And so since we're on state 2, we can have different exclusive gates. So I'm going to have one for left and one for right. And so these are only going to get input when the state is 2 and this isn't the target. Let's move these up. I'm going to set the priority to something higher. And now we will need some signal manipulators. Okay, and what's going to go into the signal manipulators is the angle difference. If our angle is negative, that means it's to the left, right? We can see here, this is a negative angle. And so this one can be switched to if we go left, but not if we go right. And if it's positive, that means we can switch to it to the right. So if this is left, that means our angle is going to be from negative 180 to 0. Oh, not negative 180. So negative pi. And I'll just do negative 3.15. So the closer this is to 0, the higher this output will be. And for the right, we want to do a similar thing. This will go from 0 to 3.15, but we'll flip it. So the closer it is to 0, the higher the output will be. When this is bigger, this will get a smaller number. Okay, and so this is what's going to go into the priority on these. Okay, so it's currently 0, so they're both outputting a 1. However, if this number were different, like not 0, if this were closer to pi, we can see that the values are going down. When it's negative, the further away it is from 0, the lower this value becomes. So a lower priority. And when it's positive, the lower the priority becomes, the further it is from 0. If it's not targeted and the angle difference is less than 0, that will send a signal into this left thing. And if it's greater than 0 and we're not targeted, that will send a signal into the right gate. And then we'll get out a couple nodes. These will have nothing going on with them there like that. And the active gate will power these nodes. So we have switch left going into this node, and we have switch right going into this node. And so if we have two things out there, if I press left or right, we see that these nodes don't turn on because this one's being targeted. Whereas this one, we see that the angle is less than 0 and it's not targeted. So when we press left, this gets a signal through this node. Now, if we were to have a second one over here to the left, and when I say left, I mean from this direction, we can see both of these get like a signal, but this one has the higher priority because it's closer, and so only this node is turned on. And the same thing would be true the other way for the right. So once one of these sends something, what we want to do is we want to set state to 3. So we want to set state to 3, And then we want to set this, whichever one is sending the signal out, we want to set that as the target. So this will set state to 3. And then I believe we should be able to send this to here, which then sets this object to targeted. It sets state to 2, and we don't have to worry about the switch direction anymore. So let's see what happens when we do that. Let's go ahead and make this shorter, and we'll set this to play once mode. So I'm targeting this one, and if I hit left on the stick, this one is now the target, and we see we're on 2. If I hit right, so we're able to switch back and forth. We can see this happening here. And when I get to the end, if I hit left, there's nothing to trigger that, so nothing happens. It doesn't break, it doesn't go to stage 3, because nothing's setting it to that. So now we can switch back and forth. And I believe that didn't add any extra delay, because it's still just 2 frames. Okay, so let's go into play mode, test this out. So I'm targeting this one, and I can switch to the right, I can switch to the left, and if I get all the way to the right, I can keep pressing right, but nothing happens. Seems to be working pretty well. I can run around. Now if I hit left, it should go to that one over there. I am targeting this one, this one, this one, and this one. So it always works based off relative to the direction the player is looking. And of course, if I get too far away, then everything resets and I'm good to go. Or alternatively, I can just press the target button again and the target system turns off. And of course, these don't have to be in a line either. Like this works based off degrees and angles. So these can be, different angles and stuff. So it targeted this one because it was closest, but as I hit the stick left and right, we can see the character aims correctly at the targeted one. I think what I can do is, let's try this. I'll put a camera pointer in the puppet. There we go. Okay, there we go. Yeah, okay, so it'll actually follow now. Yeah, it works pretty well. Though there are a couple of instances where things might work a little differently than you expect. For example, if 2 things are perfectly in a line like this, you might run into some issues. Let's see. Yeah, you see it targets the furthest one back, which is interesting. But if you just sidestep a little bit, then there's no problem. But we can see it works perfectly off the angles based off which way the player is looking. And yeah, I think it's pretty neat. I haven't really seen anything like this in Dreams before, so it's kind of exciting to see this. I hope people find some use out of this. It works so well. It feels really good. Not gonna lie, this feels fantastic. This doesn't feel janky. There doesn't seem to be any weird edge cases that break it. Yeah, it's great. Okay, sweet.